The US military had a plan. It was called War Plan Red. This plan talked about a war. It was a war against the British Empire, and it involved Canada. The plan was a secret. It was made many years ago. It was made in the early 1900s. People sometimes find out about old military plans. These plans can be surprising. War Plan Red is one of those plans. It said the US might invade Canada. This sounds very strange today. Canada and the US are close friends. They have been friends for a long time. They share a long border. It is a peaceful border. There is no wall. There are no soldiers lined up. But there was a time when things were different. Not really different in how people felt, but different in how militaries thought. Military planners look at many things. They look at all possible threats. They think about all possible wars. They do this even if war seems unlikely. It is their job. They have to be ready. They make plans for everything. War Plan Red was one of these plans. It was not a plan to actually start a war. It was a plan if a war started. The US was not looking to fight Canada. It was looking to protect itself. It worried about the British Empire. The British Empire was very big. It was very powerful. It had a big navy. It had land all over the world. Canada was part of the British Empire. So, if the US fought Britain, Canada would be involved. That is how the thinking went. The US military created many plans. They had plans for different countries. They gave code names to these countries. Red was the code name for the British Empire. Blue was the code name for the United States. So, War Plan Red was a plan against the British Empire. It was not just about Canada, but Canada was important in the plan. Canada shared a border with the US. It was a long border. It was an important border. This made Canada a key part of any war with Britain. The US planners saw Canada as a way for Britain to attack, or as a way for Britain to set up its forces. They wanted to stop that. They wanted to make sure the US was safe. This plan was written down. It was updated over the years. It existed through the 1920s and 1930s. This was before World War II. It was a time when the world was uncertain. Many countries were still figuring things out. The US was becoming stronger. It was becoming a world power, but it still saw other powers as potential rivals. Britain was one of them. The US had fought Britain before. They fought in the American Revolution. They fought in the War of 1812. Those wars were long ago, but memories can stay. Military thinking can also stay. It makes plans based on history. It makes plans based on what could happen. The idea of invading Canada sounds aggressive. It sounds like the US wanted to take Canada. But that was not the real point. The point was defense. The US wanted to secure its northern border. It wanted to stop Britain from using Canada. If Britain declared war on the US, then Canada would be a front line. That was the military logic. It was not about wanting Canada's land. It was about preventing a threat. It was about making sure the US could win a war with a powerful enemy, an enemy that had a presence right next door. The plan itself was very detailed. It talked about specific cities. It talked about how many soldiers would be needed. It talked about how to move them. It talked about what roads to take. It talked about what ports to capture. It was a serious plan. It was not just an idea. It was a full military document. It was kept secret for decades. It was classified. Few people knew about it. It came out much later. When it did come out, it caused a stir. People were surprised. They wondered if the US really meant it. They wondered if Canada knew. But it is important to remember the context. This was not a plan for an unprovoked attack. It was a plan for war that might happen. It was a contingency. Militaries always make these plans. They plan for the worst. They hope for the best. This plan was part of that process. It showed the US taking its defense seriously. It showed it looking at all angles. Or even uncomfortable ones, even ones involving its closest neighbor, because at that time, that neighbor was part of a bigger empire. An empire the US saw as a possible threat. So, the US military did plan to invade Canada. But it was not an invasion out of malice. It was an invasion out of strategic thinking. It was a defensive move. It was part of a bigger picture. It was about the British Empire. So Canada just happened to be in the middle. It was a location. It was a potential staging ground. That is how the US planners saw it. This plan gives us a look back. It shows us how countries thought. It shows us how they prepared, even for things that never came true. And thankfully, this particular plan never came true. The relationship between the US and Canada went a different way. It became one of the strongest friendships in the world. But the plan still existed, and its details are worth understanding. War Plan Red was not vague. It was very specific. It detailed how the US would fight a war with the British Empire. and a big part of that was dealing with Canada. The plan said that the US would need to act fast. Speed was important. The goal was to stop Britain from bringing in troops. Britain had a big navy. It could send soldiers to Canada, they would come across the Atlantic Ocean. The US wanted to prevent this. So, the plan called for quick strikes. These strikes would go deep into Canada, they would capture key areas. The plan listed specific targets. On the East Coast, Halifax was a major target. Halifax is a port city. It has a good harbor. It was seen as a key entry point for British forces. The US would attack Halifax. They would capture it. This would cut off a supply route. It would stop British ships from landing. Another target was Quebec City and Montreal. These cities are in central Canada. They are on the St. Lawrence River. Controlling these cities would control that river. It would cut off much of eastern Canada. It would also block movement further west. In the middle of the continent, the plan looked at Winnipeg. Winnipeg is a major city in Manitoba. It is a hub for railways. It is a center for transportation. Capturing Winnipeg would cut off Western Canada. It would stop movement across the country. This was important for a country as big as Canada. Cutting its transportation lines would hurt its ability to fight. It would stop it from moving troops and supplies. On the west coast, Vancouver was a target. Vancouver is another major port. It is also a railway hub. Like Halifax, it was seen as a place for British ships to land. Capturing Vancouver would secure the Pacific coast. It would also stop any British forces from coming in from that side. The plan also mentioned smaller border towns. These towns would be taken quickly. They would secure the immediate border. This was to prevent any immediate Canadian attacks, or any immediate British buildup. The plan detailed how many soldiers the US would use. It talked about a very large force. It was many hundreds of thousands of men. This was a huge number for the time. It showed the scale of the perceived threat. It showed how seriously the US took this. They would use tanks. They would use airplanes. These were newer technologies then. But the plan incorporated them. It was a modern military plan. It used the best thinking available. The plan talked about the timing. It said the invasion should happen quickly, within hours of war being declared. Or even before war was formally declared. This was to gain an advantage. It was to surprise the enemy. It was to prevent them from getting ready. This is a common military strategy. Strike first. Strike hard. Gain the upper hand. The plan made assumptions. It assumed that Canada would fight. It assumed Canada would be loyal to the British Empire. It did not assume Canada would simply surrender. It prepared for strong resistance. It also assumed that the US could win. It assumed the US had the resources. It assumed it had the manpower. It assumed it had the will. The plan was about taking territory. But it was also about destroying things. It talked about destroying infrastructure, bridges, railways, communication lines. This would make it harder for the enemy to fight back. It would slow them down. It would isolate parts of Canada. This would make it easier for the US to control. The plan even discussed how to handle the population. It talked about how to maintain order. It talked about how to keep essential services going. These were detailed thoughts. They went beyond just fighting. They went into how to occupy land. This shows the depth of the planning. It was not just an attack plan, it was a war plan. A plan for winning and then holding territory. The details were cold and calculated. They were military plans. They did not talk about friendship. They did not talk about shared history. They talked about strategic points. They talked about objectives. They talked about logistics. This is how militaries think. They detach themselves from emotion. They focus on the task. The task was to secure the US. And in this plan, that meant neutralizing the British threat. And that threat would come through Canada. So, while it sounds shocking, the specifics of War Plan Red make sense in a military context. They show a detailed strategy, they show a clear set of objectives, they show a determination to defend the US. By any means necessary, even if those means involved an invasion of its northern neighbor. A neighbor that was at the time still very much part of the powerful British Empire. And that empire was seen as a potential rival, and that is why such a detailed plan was drawn up. It was a plan for a hypothetical conflict, but it was a very real plan with real strategic targets. And War Plan Red did not happen in a vacuum. It was part of a bigger global picture. The early 20th century was a time of big shifts. Empires were still powerful, but new powers were rising. The United States was one of these rising powers. It had grown a lot. It had a strong economy. It had a growing military. It wanted to be a major player on the world stage. Britain was still a dominant power. The British Empire was vast. It covered much of the globe. It had a massive navy. This navy was the strongest in the world. The US looked at this, it saw a powerful neighbor. It saw a country that might challenge its interests. Even if Britain and the US were often allies, military planners do not assume friendship will last forever. They planned for all possibilities. The US had its own interests. It wanted to be secure. It wanted to expand its influence. It wanted to protect its trade routes. A strong British presence in Canada could threaten these things. If Britain and the US ever had a major disagreement, Canada would be a key location. It was a natural place for British forces to gather. It was a place from which to launch operations against the US. The US wanted to prevent this. So War Plan Red was not just about Canada. It was about the British Empire. Because Canada was Red territory. It was part of the empire. Any US plan against Britain had to include Canada. It was a geographical reality. It was a political reality. It was a military reality. The planners were simply acknowledging this. They were not making up new enemies. They were planning for existing relationships. The plan was developed over many years. It was updated, it was refined, it changed as the world changed, but the core idea stayed. The idea of a strong British presence in Canada. The idea of needing to secure the northern border. The idea of preventing an enemy from using Canadian land. The interwar period was a tense time. World War I had just ended, but new conflicts were brewing. Germany was rising again. Japan was expanding. The world was not a peaceful place. Countries were wary of each other. They built up their militaries. They made plans. They tried to be ready for anything. And War Plan Red was a product of this time. It reflected the general mistrust. It reflected the defensive mindset of nations. It is important to see this plan as a contingency. It was not in order to invade. It was a what-if scenario. What if war broke out with Britain? What would the US do? How would it defend itself? How would it win? This is standard practice for any military. They prepare for wars they hope never happen. They think through every possible scenario. This includes scenarios involving friendly nations, because friendships can change, and allegiances can shift. The US military had other plans too. They had plans for a war with Japan, War Plan Orange. They had plans for a war with Mexico, War Plan Green. They had many color-coded plans. Each one was a study. Each one was an exercise in strategic thinking. They were all about being prepared. They were all about national security. The existence of War Plan Red does not mean the US hated Canada. It does not mean the US wanted to conquer Canada for no reason. It means the US military was doing its job. Its job was to protect the United States. Its job was to prepare for all threats. The greatest threat at the time was from powerful empires. The British Empire was one of them. And Canada was a key part of that empire. Geographically, it sat right next to the US. So the plan was a reflection of the global power dynamics. It was a reflection of military thinking. It was a reflection of a time when the world was less certain. It was about security. It was about defense. It was about preparing for the unthinkable, even if the unthinkable involved a neighbor. A neighbor who was part of a bigger, more powerful entity that could pose a threat. The plan was very much a product of its era, an era of empires, rivalries, and growing global tensions. It showed the US taking its place as a rising power seriously, and planning accordingly for any challenges. The US military kept War Plan Red a secret. They did not want Canada to know, they did not want Britain to know. But countries watch each other, they try to find out things. Canada had its own military thinkers. They also looked at the US. They wondered about US intentions. They saw the growing power of the US. They knew they shared a long border. So, Canada also made its own plans. Canada had a plan too. It was called Defense Scheme Number 1. This plan was also a secret. It talked about how Canada would defend itself. It talked about how it would defend against a US invasion. This plan was made around the same time. It was made in the 1920s. It showed that Canada also thought about these things. It showed they were aware of the possibility. Defense Scheme Number 1 was developed by a Canadian officer. His name was James Sutherland Brown. He was a smart military strategist. He knew the US was a powerful neighbor. He knew that Canada was part of the British Empire. He saw the potential for conflict. His plan talked about preemptive strikes. It said Canada might need to attack first. This would happen if war with the US seemed certain. The Canadian plan talked about destroying US infrastructure. It talked about cutting roads and railways. It talked about making it hard for US troops to advance. It also talked about getting help from Britain. It assumed that Britain would come to Canada's aid. This shows the deep ties to the British Empire. Canada relied on Britain for its defense. So, while the US plan was secret, the idea of a US invasion was not totally new to Canadian thinkers. They considered it. They planned for it. This shows how military minds work. They do not assume peace. They assume conflict, they prepare for it, they look at all possible enemies, they look at all possible threats. Both countries had these plans. They were both secret. This is a strange part of history. Two nations, who would later become close allies, were secretly planning to fight each other. They were planning to invade each other. It was a quiet dance of suspicion and preparation. The Canadian government probably did not know the full details of War Plan Red, but they knew the general idea. They knew the US was a powerful neighbor. They knew they needed to be ready. Defense Scheme Number 1 shows this. It shows Canada was not naive. It was not blind to the possibilities. Over time, things changed. The relationship between the US and Canada grew stronger. The British Empire became less powerful. The idea of a war between the US and Britain faded. The shared threat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II brought the US and Canada much closer. They fought side by side. They became firm allies. This common purpose changed everything. The plans became irrelevant. War Plan Red was put on a shelf. Defense Scheme Number 1 was also put away. They became historical curiosities. They showed a different time, a time of different alliances, a time of different fears. When War Plan Red was declassified, it caused a stir. People were surprised. They wondered if it was true. They wondered if the US really meant to invade. But by then, the relationship was so strong, it was clear that the plan was just a relic. It was a piece of military history. It was not a sign of current intentions. The knowledge of these plans might have hurt relations. If they had become public earlier, it could have caused problems. It could have caused mistrust. But they stayed secret for a long time. By the time they came out, the world had changed. The US and Canada were already close. They were already partners. So Canada did not know the exact details. But it had its own fears. It had its own plans. It also planned for a US invasion. This shows that the military logic was similar on both sides. Both countries understood the geography. Both understood the power dynamics, both prepared for the worst. It is a stark reminder of how military thinking works. It is always about readiness. It is always about defense, even against those who might seem like friends. Because in military planning, nothing is taken for granted. War Plan Red is a piece of history. It is a look into the past. It tells us about how countries thought. It tells us about how militaries planned. It shows us that even close neighbors can be seen as potential threats. This might seem strange today. The US and Canada are good friends. Their border is peaceful. They work together on many things. But the plan reminds us that things can change, and that planners must always consider change. The plan was officially dropped in the 1930s. It became obsolete. The world moved on. The British Empire changed. The US and Canada became allies. World War II ended the old rivalries. It created new ones. The Cold War then set in. That brought the US and Canada even closer. They faced a common enemy. That enemy was the Soviet Union. So War Plan Red was never acted upon. It never became a real war. It never led to an invasion. It remained a document, a set of instructions, a what-if scenario. But its existence is still important. It tells us about the nature of military planning. Militaries do not plan for peace. They plan for war. They plan for worst-case scenarios. They plan for every possible enemy, even if those enemies are also friends. The plan reminds us of the power of context. In the early 20th century, the British Empire was a global force. Canada was part of it. The US was a rising power. It felt vulnerable. It felt it needed to protect itself. This context is key to understanding War Plan Red. Without it, the plan seems aggressive and nonsensical. With it, it makes a strange kind of military sense. It was a defensive strategy in a world that felt uncertain. The story of War Plan Red also shows how much the US-Canada relationship has grown. It has moved beyond suspicion. It has moved beyond rivalry. It has become a model for international cooperation. The two countries share values, they share interests, they share a long history of peace. The idea of the US invading Canada today is unthinkable. It is absurd. The plan is a testament to how far things have come. The declassification of War Plan Red happened much later. It was in the 1970s. When it became public, it caused some shock. But it did not damage the relationship. By then, the ties were too strong. The plan was seen as an old relic. It was a historical footnote. It was not a present threat. It also reminds us that military plans are not always about current intentions. They are about readiness, they are about capability, they are about imagining the worst. They are about being prepared. A plan does not mean a desire, it means a preparedness. This is a key difference. The US military desired peace, but it prepared for war. So, did the US military plan to invade Canada? Yes, it did. But it was a contingency plan. It was a defensive plan. It was part of a broader strategy against the British Empire. It was not an aggressive desire to conquer Canada. It was a very detailed plan for a hypothetical war. A war that thankfully never happened. War Plan Red is a good story. It teaches us about history. It teaches us about military strategy. It teaches us about the evolution of international relations. It shows us that peace is not always a given. It shows us that relationships can change. And it shows us that sometimes the most surprising plans are made. But thankfully, they often stay just as plans. And, in the case of War Plan Red, that is a very good thing for both the United States and Canada. Their long peace is a better story.